Welcome students. In the previous lecture, we have seen the introduction of chromatography, classification of chromatography and some basic information about paper chromatography with the type of paper chromatography, that is ascending paper chromatography and descending paper chromatography. Now we are proceeding further. Now students, let us see in detail the paper chromatography. As paper used, the name paper chromatography. Here the paper is cut into the size of glass plate. The paper is of Whatman filter paper. This is the size of the filter paper cut into the size of glass plate, and from one edge the line of application, this is the line of application, is drawn with HB pencil. The line of application is also known as the line of starting. Now on this line of application the sample is spotted. Here you can see the drop which is a spotted. When the spotted drop is dried, the application of another drop is done and again the spot is dried. The spot must be compact and not spread out much. Now this paper is kept for development of the solvent in the solvent chamber. Now this is the chamber in which the solvent is kept. The solvent is kept here and therefore it is the variety of ascending paper chromatography. Now the paper is hanged with a clamp. This is the paper and the edge of the paper is just touching the solvent. As the edge touches the solvent rises through the paper due to the capillary action. The solvent chamber is enriched with vapors of the solvent, that is, the solvent chamber is saturated. To avoid the evaporation of the solvent, the lid is kept on the chamber. Now, the paper is kept for development. The development is done depending upon two factors. The development of the solvent for required time or the development of the solvent for the required distance. Now, here the solvent front is allowed to develop for required distance. Here the solvent front is travel the distance. When the solvent front rises or travels through the paper, it travels with him the spot, that is the sample, and the components of the sample are also traveling with the solvent. Depending upon the affinity, the more affinited components are separated at the closer distance, while the components having least affinity will travel further and are separated at the longer distance. These are the components which are traveled and separated at the closer distance, while this is the component which is a travel for more distance because it is having the least affinity with the solvent, and thus the components of the mixture are separated. Now, after developing the paper with the solvent, the paper is taken out of the solvent and it is dried, and it is observed if the separated components are colored, they can be easily located, while the separated components are colorless, then they may be located by using the reagents like rubenic acid and exposing to ammonia. When the separated components are located, the distances of the separated components and the distance traveled by the solvent front is measured, and these distances we will look into the next measurement of distances. The first component, red component, is a travel to 2 centimeter. Second component travel to the distance of 6 centimeter. The third one is traveling to the distance of 8 centimeter. Now the distance of the solvent front is 10 centimeter. Now this component red is most affinity to the solvent, and therefore it is separated at the closer distance, and therefore this RF value is calculated by this information. Now the calculation of RF value is done by taking the ratios, the ratio of distance moved by the solute to the distance moved by the solvent is taken, and it is referred as RF value. Now here the distance moved by the solute is x, and distance, this is the x, and the distance moved by the solvent front is a y, and therefore the RF value is x by y, and by this we can have the separation of the components of the mixture on paper chromatography. Now this is the variety of ascending paper chromatography, where the solvent is kept at the bottom of the solvent chamber and it rises in the upward direction through the paper due to the capillary action. The second variety, where the solvent moves through the paper in the downward direction, is, we have seen, it is termed as descending paper chromatography. The technique is same, only the direction of the solvent is downward, and in such case the solvent is kept at the top of the chamber, and thus the paper on which the sample is spotted on the reference line is kept, the reference line edge is just immersed in the solvent at the top, and the solvent is allowed to develop. As the edge of the paper touches the solvent rises, or it travels through the paper and it travels in the downward direction. While traveling, it takes with it the spotted components. The components of the mixture are separated again depending upon the affinity to the solvent. I will show the diagram of descending chromatography. Okay. Here you can observe the variety descending paper chromatography. Here the solvent is kept at the top and the spotted line, that is the line of application, is at the top, and paper is just, that is the edge of the paper just touches the solvent, and thus the solvent flows through the paper due to the gravity and capillary action in the downward direction. As the solvent moves, it travels along with it the components of the mixture. Depending upon the affinity, the components are separated. The components having least affinity are separated at the longer distance, while the components having most affinity are separated at the smaller distance. The development of the paper is done on the two bases, depending upon the distance or depending upon the time. After development of the solvent through the paper is removed from the solvent chamber. It is dried, the components are located and the distances are measured, and from that distances the RF value is calculated. Thus, we have seen the information about paper chromatography, the two varieties of paper chromatography, ascending paper chromatography and descending paper chromatography. Okay. With this, I conclude my lecture. Thank you.